They said I was the family disappointment who couldn't stick to anything, but when Dr. Martinez looked at my family and said Jamie saved more lives than any of us, their cruel birthday prank suddenly didn't seem so funny anymore. I remember that morning like it was yesterday, the way the autumn light filtered through the kitchen window while my sister Sarah made her passive-aggressive comments about my latest job change. The smell of coffee mixed with the tension that always seemed to follow me into family gatherings, that familiar weight of being the one who never quite measured up to their expectations. Before I share what happened that day, I want to know you're here with me. Just say listening in the comments or let me know where you are. I love hearing how far my story reaches and knowing that my truth matters to someone out there. My family had this way of looking at me that made me feel like I was always apologizing for existing. Sarah with her law degree and her perfect house, Michael with his corporate job and his pristine credit score, and Mom and Dad who loved to introduce them with glowing pride while I got the awkward pause and the quick subject change. They saw a 32-year-old woman who had moved 7 times in 5 years, who took jobs that didn't make sense to them, who disappeared for weeks at a time and came back looking tired and worn down. They saw failure where I saw purpose, instability where I saw flexibility, and chaos where I saw the messy, beautiful work of healing. I had learned to accept their version of me because it was easier than trying to explain what I really did. How do you tell people that you spend your days with kids who have been abandoned, abused, betrayed by every adult who was supposed to protect them? How do you describe the way a 15-year-old looks at you when they finally trust someone enough to tell their story, or the weight of holding space for trauma that would break most people? My family wanted neat explanations and linear career paths, but my work existed in the spaces between their understanding. The birthday surprise had been Sarah's idea, of course. She had called me 2 weeks before, her voice bright with that fake enthusiasm she used when she was planning something she thought was clever. Jamie, we want to do something special for your birthday this year, something different. We know you've been going through a lot with all the job changes and moving around, so we thought a surprise party would be perfect. Just trust us, okay? We want to celebrate you properly for once. I should have known something was wrong when she insisted on the blindfold. Michael picked me up that morning, chattering nervously about how excited everyone was, how they had been planning this for weeks. The blindfold was soft against my eyes, expensive silk that smelled like Sarah's perfume. She had thought of everything, even the details that would make the humiliation feel more deliberate. I sat in the passenger seat of Michael's car, listening to the familiar roads beneath the tires, trying to guess where we were going based on the turns and the time it took to get there. Mom's voice floated from the back seat, artificially cheerful in the way it got when she was overcompensating for something. We just want you to know how much we love you, honey. This is going to be such a special day, something you'll never forget. I can hear the words now and I wonder if she knew what they were really planning, if she was trying to convince herself as much as me that what they were about to do came from a place of love rather than frustration. The car stopped and I heard the sound of gravel crunching under the tires. Country sounds surrounded us, birds singing and wind rustling through trees that sounded old and full. The air smelled different when Michael opened my door, cleaner and greener than the suburbs where we had grown up. I could hear the others getting out of their cars, multiple vehicles that meant the whole family was here for whatever surprise they had planned. They led me carefully across uneven ground, Sarah's hand on my left elbow and Michael's on my right. I could feel grass beneath my feet, then dirt, then what felt like gravel again. The walk seemed to take forever, and I could hear them whispering to each other in voices too low for me to understand. There was an excitement in their whispers that felt different from birthday surprise excitement, sharper somehow, more anticipatory in a way that made my stomach twist with unease. The structure we approached had that hollow sound that big empty spaces make. My footsteps echoed differently once we were inside, and I could smell old wood and hay, the kind of smell that meant we were in a barn or some kind of agricultural building. The temperature was cooler here, and I could feel the vastness of the space around me even with my eyes covered. They positioned me in what felt like the center of the space, adjusting my shoulders so I was facing what I assumed was the main entrance. "Ready?" Sarah asked, and I could hear the smile in her voice, the kind of smile that didn't reach her eyes. I nodded, expecting to see balloons and cake and the familiar faces of my family arranged in celebration. Instead, When the blindfold fell away, I saw the inside of an old barn, weathered wooden beams reaching up into dusty shadows, hay bales stacked in corners, and empty space stretching out around me like a question mark. My family stood clustered near the entrance, watching me with expressions I couldn't quite read. There was something triumphant in their faces, but also nervous, like they weren't entirely sure how their joke was going to land. The silence stretched between us, broken only by the sound of wind moving through the gaps in the barn walls and the distant lowing of cattle somewhere across the fields. "Surprise," Sarah said, and her voice had that sharp edge it got when she was being cruel on purpose. "We thought you should have your party somewhere that suits you. Somewhere for people who can't quite fit into normal places." The words hit me like a physical blow, and I felt my face go hot with embarrassment and hurt. Michael laughed, a sound that was trying too hard to be casual, and Mom looked away like she couldn't quite meet my eyes. "This is where people like you belong, isn't it?" Sarah continued, warming up to her theme now. "Always moving around, never settling down, never quite fitting in anywhere. We figured you'd be comfortable in a place for strays and things that don't have a real home." Dad shifted uncomfortably, but didn't say anything to stop her, and I realized that this wasn't Sarah's idea alone. They had all agreed to this, had all thought that humiliating me would somehow teach me a lesson about stability and normal life. I stood there in the center of that empty barn, feeling the weight of their disappointment and their cruelty settling around me like dust. The birthday surprise was that they had driven me out to the middle of nowhere to tell me, in the most dramatic way possible, that I was the family failure. The barn was a metaphor made manifest, a place for animals and things that didn't belong in polite society, and they had brought me here to make their point about where I fit in their world. "You can find your own way home," Michael said, jingling his keys in a way that was supposed to sound casual, but came across as deliberately dismissive. "Maybe the walk will give you time to think about what you want to do with your life." They turned to leave, all of them together, their footsteps echoing in the empty space as they walked away from me without looking back. I listened to their car doors slamming, to the engine starting, to the sound of gravel crunching as they drove away and left me alone in that barn with nothing but my hurt and my anger and the echo of their laughter fading into the distance. The silence that followed was complete, broken only by the sound of my own breathing and the settling of old wood around me. I sat down on a hay bale and let myself feel the full weight of what they had done. Not just the cruelty of the joke, but the planning that had gone into it, the coordination required to get everyone to agree, the deliberate choice to hurt me in a way that would stick. They had used my trust against me, had used my willingness to believe that they wanted to celebrate me as a weapon to deliver their verdict on my worth. But even in that moment, sitting alone in that barn with my birthday surprise revealed as nothing more than elaborate mockery, I knew something they didn't know. I knew that while they were planning this humiliation, while they were congratulating themselves on their clever way of putting me in my place, I had been doing work that mattered. I had been saving lives in ways they couldn't understand, helping kids who had been abandoned and betrayed just like I was being abandoned and betrayed now. The irony wasn't lost on me that they had brought me to a place for strays to tell me I was a stray, when my entire life was built around creating safe spaces for kids who had been thrown away by people who were supposed to love them. They thought they were teaching me a lesson about belonging, but they were really just showing me how much I already knew about the cruelty that families could inflict on their most vulnerable members. I was still sitting there, processing the hurt and the anger and the sad familiarity of being rejected by the people who were supposed to know me best, when I heard the sound of cars approaching. Multiple vehicles, moving fast across the gravel road that led to the barn. The engine sounded different from my family's cars, more official somehow, and I felt my heart start to race as I wondered who could be coming to this remote place and what they might want with me. The sound grew closer, and I could hear voices now, urgent and excited, calling my name across the distance between the road and the barn. Someone was looking for me, someone who knew I was here, and as the vehicles pulled up outside the barn, I realized that my family's cruel surprise might be about to collide with a surprise of an entirely different kind. The voices calling my name grew clearer as the footsteps approached, and I recognized Dr. Martinez's distinctive accent cutting through the afternoon air. "Jamie, are you in there? We've been looking everywhere for you." Your family said you were having a birthday celebration, but they seemed confused about where you actually were. I stood up from the hay bale, my heart racing as I realized that my two worlds were about to collide in the most unexpected way possible. Dr. Rebecca Martinez had been my supervisor and colleague for 3 years, ever since I started working with the most difficult cases in the trauma recovery program. She was the kind of psychologist who commanded respect in every room she entered, whose research on childhood trauma had changed how we approached healing, and whose opinion carried weight in circles my family could never imagine. She was also the person who understood my work better than anyone, who knew exactly why I moved from place to place and why I took the cases that other counselors wouldn't touch. Marcus's voice joined hers, deeper now than it had been when I first met him 4 years ago, but still carrying that careful politeness that kids who've been hurt learn to use as armor. Dr. Martinez said Jamie would be here. This is supposed to be a surprise, right? The surprise was supposed to be good, not finding me abandoned in a barn by my own family, but I couldn't explain that without explaining everything else first. I walked toward the barn entrance, my footsteps echoing in the empty space, trying to process what was happening. Dr. Martinez appeared in the doorway first, her silver hair catching the afternoon light, her expression shifting from confusion to concern as she took in the scene. Behind her came Marcus, 21 now and wearing a suit that made him look like the successful college student he had become, and behind him several other young people I recognized from my caseload over the years. Jamie, what are you doing out here alone? Dr. Martinez asked, her trained eye immediately picking up on the emotional residue of what had just happened. Where is your family? This isn't exactly what we had planned for your birthday surprise. I felt my face flush with embarrassment as I realized I was going to have to explain that my family had driven me out here as a joke, that their idea of a birthday celebration was to abandon me in a barn like some kind of unwanted animal. The story came out in pieces, halting and embarrassed, as I tried to make sense of what my family had done and why Dr. Martinez and these kids from my past were here now. Marcus's face went dark with anger when I described the blindfold and the cruel reveal, his hands clenching into fists in a way that reminded me of the angry 15-year-old I had first met in a group home in Detroit. That's messed up, Jamie. That's really messed up. How could they do that to you? Dr. Martinez's expression had shifted into the professional mask she wore when she was processing something particularly disturbing. She had seen enough family dynamics in her 30 years of practice to recognize cruelty when she heard it, and I could see her mind working through the implications of what I had just told her. Your family doesn't understand what you do, does it? She said, and it wasn't really a question. The truth was that my family had never understood what I did because I had never been able to explain it in a way that made sense to them. How do you tell people who measure success in salary figures and job titles that you spend your days with kids who have been prostituted, beaten, abandoned, and betrayed by every adult who was supposed to protect them? How do you describe the way a 16-year-old looks at you when they finally trust someone enough to tell their story, or the weight of holding space for trauma that would break most people? I had learned early in my career that my work existed in the spaces between normal understanding. The kids I worked with were the ones other counselors couldn't reach, the ones who had been labeled as hopeless or too damaged to heal. I specialized in the cases that required me to go where the need was greatest, to move from city to city following the crisis points where kids were falling through the cracks of every system designed to help them. Detroit had been my first real assignment, working with kids who had aged out of foster care with nowhere to go and no one to trust. I lived in a studio apartment above a community center, spending my days in group homes and shelters, learning to speak the language of survival that these kids had developed to protect themselves from a world that had failed them repeatedly. Marcus had been one of those kids, 15 and angry and convinced that every adult was just waiting for their chance to hurt him. He had been in and out of foster homes since he was 7, each placement failing spectacularly as his behavior became more aggressive and his trust became more impossible to earn. The file that came with him was 3 inches thick, full of incident reports and psychological evaluations that painted a picture of a kid who was beyond help. But I saw something different when I looked at Marcus, something that reminded me of myself at that age, that fierce intelligence mixed with desperate loneliness that came from being misunderstood by everyone who was supposed to care. The breakthrough came 6 months into our work together, during a session where he was telling me about a foster father who had locked him in a basement for 3 days as punishment for talking back. He was describing it in that flat, emotionless voice that trauma survivors use to protect themselves from their own memories, and I found myself crying. Not the professional tears that therapists sometimes shed, but ugly, helpless sobs that came from somewhere deeper than my training. He stopped talking and looked at me like I had lost my mind. "Why are you crying?" he asked, and I told him the truth. "Because what happened to you was wrong. Because you deserved better. Because you were just a kid and you should have been safe." Something shifted in his face then, some wall that had been holding back years of pain and anger and grief, and he started crying too. It was the first time he had cried about anything that had happened to him, and it was the beginning of his healing. From Detroit, I went to Phoenix, working with kids who had been trafficked, then to Portland for a specialized program for teens who had survived ritual abuse. Each assignment took me deeper into the world of children who had been failed by every system, and each move made my family more convinced that I was the one who was failing. They saw the frequent relocations and the emotional toll of the work and decided that I was unstable, that I couldn't hold down a real job, that I was the family disappointment who would never amount to anything. The irony was that my work was saving lives in ways they couldn't understand. Marcus went from being a kid who was headed for prison or worse to being a college student studying social work so he could help other kids like himself. Keisha from Phoenix went from being a girl who had been sold by her own mother to being a young woman who was studying to become a lawyer specializing in trafficking cases. David from Portland went from being a boy who had been ritually abused by a cult to being a young man who was training to become a trauma counselor. Each success story was a testament to what was possible when someone believed in kids that everyone else had given up on. But my family only saw the surface, the moves and the job changes and the emotional exhaustion that came with carrying other people's trauma. They saw failure where I saw purpose, instability where I saw flexibility, and chaos where I saw the messy, beautiful work of healing. Standing in that barn, looking at Dr. Martinez and Marcus and the other kids who had become successful young adults, I realized that my family's cruel joke had accidentally created the perfect opportunity for my two worlds to collide. The people who understood my worth were about to meet the people who had spent years telling me I was worthless, and the contrast was going to be impossible to ignore. Dr. Martinez was processing the situation with the clinical precision that made her such a respected figure in our field. "Jamie," she said, "I think there's something your family needs to understand about the work you do, about who you really are and what you've accomplished." Marcus nodded emphatically, his jaw set with the determination I remembered from our sessions together. "They need to know what you did for us. They need to know that you save lives." The other young people who had come with them were nodding too, their faces showing the same mix of anger and loyalty that I had seen in Marcus. These were kids who had learned to recognize real love when they saw it, who had been abandoned and betrayed enough times to know the difference between people who genuinely cared and people who just pretended to care. They had driven here to surprise me for my birthday, to show me that the work I did mattered, that the love I gave came back in ways that made all the moves and all the heartbreak worth it. "Your family is coming back," Dr. Martinez said, checking her phone. "I called them when we couldn't find you at the address they gave us. They should be here in about 10 minutes. I think it's time they learned who you really are, don't you?" Marcus grinned, the same mischievous expression I remembered from our sessions, but with a confidence now that spoke to how much he had healed and grown. "This is going to be good," he said, and I could hear the anticipation in his voice. They're about to find out that the person they think is a failure is actually a hero. The barn suddenly felt less like a place of abandonment and more like a stage where truth was about to be revealed, where the cruel joke my family had planned was about to become something entirely different. I could hear cars approaching again, the familiar sound of my family's vehicles returning to the scene of their crime. But this time they weren't coming back to an empty barn where they had left their disappointing daughter. This time they were coming back to find me surrounded by people who knew my worth, who understood my work, who could speak to the value of what I did in ways that would be impossible for them to dismiss or diminish. Dr. Martinez straightened her shoulders and checked her watch, slipping into the professional mode that had made her a force to be reckoned with in academic and clinical circles. Marcus and the others arranged themselves around me, not protectively but supportively, like a team that was about to go into battle together. The sound of gravel crunching under tires grew louder, and I realized that my family's cruel surprise was about to become the catalyst for a confrontation that would change everything between us forever. The sound of car doors slamming echoed across the fields as my family returned to the barn, their voices carrying on the wind as they approached. I could hear Sarah's laugh, that sharp sound she made when she was pleased with herself, and Michael's deeper chuckle joining in. They were still enjoying their joke, still savoring the cleverness of their cruel surprise, completely unaware that they were walking into a situation that would shatter their perception of me forever. Dr. Martinez stepped forward, positioning herself between me and the barn entrance, her professional demeanor shifting into something more formidable. Marcus moved to stand beside her, his jaw set with determination, while the other young adults arranged themselves in a loose semicircle around us. These were kids who had learned to recognize real strength when they saw it, who had been abandoned enough times to know the difference between people who genuinely cared and people who pretended to care for their own purposes. Sarah appeared in the barn entrance first, her smile faltering as she took in the unexpected scene. Behind her came Michael, Mom, and Dad, their expressions shifting from amusement to confusion as they realized that their abandoned daughter was no longer alone. The silence stretched between us, heavy with the weight of what was about to be revealed, broken only by the sound of wind moving through the gaps in the barn walls. "Well, this is unexpected," Sarah said, her voice taking on that artificial brightness she used when she was trying to regain control of a situation. "Jamie, you made some friends already. How resourceful of you." Her words carried the same condescending tone she had used earlier, but there was uncertainty in her voice now, a recognition that something about the scene didn't match what she had planned. Dr. Martinez stepped forward, her silver hair catching the afternoon light, her presence commanding immediate attention. "I'm Dr. Rebecca Martinez," she said, her voice carrying the authority that came from 30 years of clinical practice and research. "I'm Jamie's supervisor and colleague. We came here today to surprise Jamie for their birthday, but it seems we're the ones who are surprised by what we've found." The word colleague hit my family like a physical blow, and I watched their faces as they processed the implications. Sarah's eyes narrowed as she tried to reconcile the image of her failure sister with the presence of this obviously accomplished woman who spoke about Jamie as an equal. Michael shifted uncomfortably, his earlier confidence beginning to crack as he realized that something fundamental about their understanding was wrong. "Supervisor," Mom repeated, her voice small and confused. "Jamie never mentioned having a supervisor. We thought they were just doing temp work, jumping from job to job without any real direction." The hurt in her voice was genuine, the confusion of a mother who was discovering that she didn't know her own child at all. Dr. Martinez's expression softened slightly, but her voice remained firm. "Jamie has been working as a trauma counselor specializing in the most difficult cases for the past 5 years. They work with children who have been abandoned, abused, trafficked, and failed by every system designed to protect them. The moves you see as instability are actually assignments to crisis points where their expertise is most needed." Marcus stepped forward then, his young face serious with the weight of what he was about to share. "My name is Marcus Williams," he said, his voice steady despite the emotion I could see in his eyes. 5 years ago, I was a 15-year-old kid in Detroit who had been bounced around foster homes since I was 7. Everyone had given up on me. I was angry, violent, convinced that every adult was just waiting for their chance to hurt me. The barn had become a courtroom, and Marcus was delivering testimony that would change everything my family thought they knew about me. I had a file 3 inches thick full of incident reports and psychological evaluations that said I was hopeless, beyond help, a lost cause. But Jamie saw something different when they looked at me. They saw a kid who was hurt and scared and desperate for someone to believe in them. Sarah's face had gone pale, and I could see her struggling to process what she was hearing. This confident young man in a suit, speaking with eloquence and purpose about trauma and healing, didn't match the image of the kind of person she thought I worked with. The cognitive dissonance was written across her features as she tried to reconcile her assumptions with the reality standing before her. Jamie spent 6 months working with me, Marcus continued, his voice growing stronger as he spoke. They came to every session, no matter how badly I acted out, no matter how many times I tried to push them away. They were the first adult who ever cried when I told them what had happened to me, the first person who said that what happened was wrong and that I deserved better. Dr. Martinez nodded, her professional mask slipping to reveal genuine emotion. Marcus is now a junior at Wayne State University studying social work. He's maintained a 4.0 GPA while working part-time at a community center helping other at-risk youth. Last month, he received a scholarship to continue his graduate studies in trauma counseling. The pride in her voice was unmistakable, and I felt my throat tighten with emotion as I watched my family process this information. Marcus wasn't just a success story. He was proof of what was possible when someone believed in kids that everyone else had written off. He was living evidence of the value of the work I did, work that my family had dismissed as job hopping and instability. One by one, the other young adults stepped forward to share their stories. Keisha from Phoenix, now studying law with a focus on trafficking cases. David from Portland, training to become a trauma counselor himself. Ashley from Seattle, who had aged out of foster care and was now working as an advocate for homeless youth. Each story was a testament to resilience and healing, each success a direct result of the work my family had never understood. Jamie doesn't just counsel these kids, Dr. Martinez explained as the testimonies concluded. They live where the need is greatest, often in difficult conditions, carrying emotional burdens that would break most people. The turnover rate in their field is enormous because the work is so demanding, but Jamie has never walked away from a case, never given up on a child, never chosen the easy path over the right path. My father, who had been silent throughout the revelations, finally spoke. We didn't know, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Jamie never told us what they were really doing. We thought they couldn't hold down a regular job, couldn't commit to anything stable. The words came out slowly, as if he was processing each one as he spoke it. I found my voice then, though it came out shakier than I wanted. How could I tell you what I did when you had already decided what kind of person I was? How could I explain that I was saving lives when you saw every move as evidence of failure? You wanted neat explanations and linear career paths, but my work exists in the spaces between your understanding. The silence that followed was different from the earlier silence, heavy with recognition and regret rather than anticipation. Sarah's confident smirk had disappeared completely, replaced by something that looked like shame. Michael was staring at the ground, unable to meet my eyes. Mom had tears streaming down her face, and Dad looked like he had aged years in the space of minutes. Dr. Martinez wasn't finished. In our field, Jamie is considered one of the most effective trauma counselors working with high-risk youth. They have a success rate that's almost unprecedented, and their techniques for working with the most damaged children have been adopted by programs across the country. The research they've contributed to has changed how we approach childhood trauma recovery. Marcus stepped closer to me, his voice fierce with loyalty. When you brought Jamie out here and left them in this barn like they were some kind of stray animal, you did the same thing that every other adult in my life had done. You threw away someone precious because you didn't understand their value. But the difference is that Jamie never threw us away, never gave up on us, never stopped believing we were worth saving. The power of his words hit my family like a physical force, and I watched as the full weight of what they had done settled over them. They had taken their daughter, their sister, someone who spent their life saving abandoned children, and they had abandoned her in the cruelest way possible. The irony was so complete it was almost poetic. Sarah was the first to break, her composed facade crumbling as she started to cry. Jamie, I'm so sorry. We didn't know. We thought you were just drifting, just unable to find your place. We were trying to shock you into stability, but we were so wrong about everything. Her apology came out in broken sentences, interrupted by sobs that seemed to come from somewhere deep and genuine. Dr. Martinez's voice softened as she looked at my family with something that might have been compassion. The work Jamie does requires tremendous emotional strength and flexibility. The children they help have been failed by rigid systems and inflexible thinking. Jamie's ability to adapt, to meet these kids where they are, to move where they're needed most, isn't instability. It's exactly what makes them so effective. I looked around the barn, at the young adults who had driven hours to surprise me for my birthday, at Dr. Martinez who had taken time from her busy schedule to coordinate this gathering, at my family who were processing the complete destruction of their understanding of who I was. The space that had been meant to symbolize my worthlessness had become a place where my true value was finally being recognized. But even in this moment of vindication, I found myself thinking about Grace. About the choice between using this revelation as a weapon to hurt them back or as an opportunity to heal something that had been broken between us for years. I thought about the kids I worked with, about how they had to choose every day between revenge and recovery, between holding on to hurt and moving toward healing. Mom approached me slowly, her face streaked with tears. "Honey, can you ever forgive us? We were so blind, so focused on what we thought success should look like that we couldn't see the incredible work you were doing. We turned our disappointment in ourselves into disappointment in you, and that was wrong on every level." I looked at her, at all of them, and felt something shift inside me. The hurt was still there, would probably always be there to some degree, but it was joined now by something else. Understanding, maybe, or at least the beginning of it. They had acted from ignorance rather than malice, from fear rather than cruelty, and while that didn't excuse what they had done, it made forgiveness possible. "I don't need your apologies to know my worth," I said, my voice steady now with the confidence that came from being surrounded by people who truly saw me. "But I want our relationship to be based on truth from now on. I want you to understand that the work I do matters, that the life I've chosen has value, even if it doesn't look like the life you would have chosen for me." Dr. Martinez smiled, the first genuine smile I had seen from her since she arrived. That's exactly the kind of wisdom that makes Jamie so effective with their clients. The ability to hold space for healing without requiring groveling, to offer forgiveness without enabling further harm. It's a rare gift, and it's part of what makes them exceptional at their work. The afternoon sun was starting to slant through the barn windows, casting long shadows across the floor where we stood. Marcus and the others began sharing lighter stories then, memories of breakthroughs and celebrations, moments of joy that had emerged from the darkness of their early experiences. The barn filled with laughter and warmth, transforming from a place of abandonment into a place of reunion and recognition. Sarah approached me hesitantly, her earlier confidence replaced by genuine humility. "I don't know how to make up for what we did today," she said. "But I want to learn about your work, really learn about it. I want to understand who you are instead of who I thought you should be." The offer felt genuine, stripped of the condescension that usually colored her interactions with me. As the gathering began to wind down, as my colleagues and the young adults prepared to head back to their various lives and commitments, I realized that something fundamental had changed in that barn. Not just in my family's understanding of me, but in my own understanding of what I needed from them. I had spent so long seeking their approval that I had forgotten I already had something better, the approval of people who truly knew my worth. The cruel joke my family had planned as a way to put me in my place had instead become the catalyst for finally putting me in my rightful place in their understanding. The barn that was meant to symbolize my status as a stray had become the place where my true family, the family of choice I had built through my work, had gathered to celebrate the person I really was. As we prepared to leave that barn behind, I felt lighter than I had in years. The burden of carrying their disappointment, of trying to measure up to their expectations while hiding my true accomplishments, had been lifted. I was free to be exactly who I was, to do the work I was called to do, with the full knowledge that my worth wasn't determined by their ability to understand it. The birthday surprise that had started as cruelty had ended as gift, the gift of truth finally spoken and finally heard. And as we walked out of that barn together, my family humbled and my chosen family proud, I knew that this birthday would be remembered not as the day they tried to break me, but as the day I finally became whole.